On a peaceful Thursday afternoon, Elizabeth Morrison stood in her kitchen and switched on the coffee maker. Florida sunlight streamed through the window, warming the new granite countertop. The laughter of neighborhood children echoed from the garden where orange trees grew. What should I make for Ryan's snack, she wondered. The clock showed 2:15. There were still 45 minutes until her son would return from school. Elizabeth opened the refrigerator and took out cheese and celery sticks. The nutritionist at St. Mary's Elementary had advised her to prepare healthy snacks, especially considering her son's heart condition. Elizabeth smiled slightly as she turned to the inventory management system for Sunshine Fashion. As store manager for 7 years, her competence was well regarded in the community. Her part-time work-from-home arrangement was granted based on that track record. Every Thursday, she would work at the store only in the morning and spend the afternoon working from home. This schedule was arranged to accommodate her son's regular checkups. Her husband Philip had left early for work this morning. With a big contract approaching at Liberty Insurance, he'd been working late recently. Once this contract is sealed, we can take Ryan to Disney World, he had said with a smile last night. Yet, there was something unsettled about his demeanor. During a break from work, Elizabeth glanced at the family photo in the living room. It captured their smiling faces after last year's Easter service at First Presbyterian Church. 6-year-old Ryan wore a light blue bow tie, looking proud. Their weekly Sunday worship was precious family time. However, on the shelf next to it sat an older photograph with another person, her sister Caroline. 10 years ago, Elizabeth had cut ties with her sister after a decisive argument over their parents' care. Caroline had abandoned their parents' care, saying she wanted to live her own life, and later, their parents passed away in an accident. Elizabeth's emotional wounds ran deep, and she continued to refuse reconciliation with her sister. Recently, she heard from a church acquaintance that Caroline was divorced and raising a child alone. She wasn't sure if the information was accurate. Since her sister barely used social media, there was no way to know her current situation. Her mother-in-law Ruth visited every weekend without fail, bringing homemade pot roast for dinner. "We're family," Ruth would say, encouraging reconciliation, and Philip agreed. But Elizabeth's heart remained stubborn. The regret of not being able to care for her parents in their final moments continued to smolder as anger toward her sister. Life in the quiet residential area of Winter Park seemed perfect on the surface. Her mother-in-law lived nearby, within quick reach if needed. Every Thursday afternoon, Ruth went grocery shopping. Her route home overlapped with St. Mary's Elementary's school path. While working at her computer, Elizabeth thought about her son's health. Although Ryan's heart condition was mild, he needed checkups twice a year. The next one was scheduled for next week at Advent Health Winter Park. She tried not to show anyone the anxiety she felt during each examination. Looking at the oak trees swaying in the wind in the garden, Elizabeth reflected, "This is the life I chose." She had sealed away the conflict with her sister and decided to focus on the happiness before her. Yet sometimes, her sister's smile would surface from the depths of her memories. The sound of yellow school buses passing by began to fill the air. It was almost time for her son to return home. Elizabeth stood up and started preparing the snack. She washed the celery sticks, cut them into small pieces, and added peanut butter, her son's favorite combination. At the intersection of Oak Street and Park Avenue, the yellow signal light began flashing to indicate school dismissal time. This intersection had become a topic of local concern due to frequent accidents. That's when the phone rang. Elizabeth put on her hands-free earpiece. It was Ruth. Her mother-in-law usually called around this time after her Thursday shopping to share information about daily necessities on sale. Elizabeth kept her eyes on the invoice on her screen and responded, "Yes, Mother." However, what came through the receiver was her mother-in-law's distraught screaming. "Elizabeth! Why aren't you at the hospital? Ryan! Ryan's been in an accident." Elizabeth's fingers froze at the sudden words. Her mind went blank. What? But he's still at school. An ambulance. An ambulance headed to Advent Health Winter Park. I saw it clearly. A boy in St. Mary's uniform, at the Oak Street intersection. Just then, the front door opened. "I'm home." Her son's voice. Elizabeth couldn't believe her ears. It was definitely Ryan's voice, yet on the phone, her mother-in-law was sobbing. "Mother, Ryan just came home. He's here." "What?" Ruth's voice trembled. "But I clearly saw it. Light blue polo shirt and navy pants. It was definitely St. Mary's uniform. At that intersection, a car." Elizabeth stood up and walked to the living room. Ryan had already put down his backpack and was proudly announcing, "Hey, I got a perfect score on my math test today." Her son was definitely there. Safe and sound. But her mother-in-law's confused voice continued. "I'm certain, that child got off the bus, and suddenly, a black SUV." Various thoughts raced through Elizabeth's mind. Yes, her son was right in front of her. But she had never heard her mother-in-law so distraught before. And the fact that a boy in St. Mary's uniform had been in an accident. "Contact Philip." Ruth's voice trailed off. "Oh, come to think of it, I think I saw Philip's car at the scene." At that moment, anxiety spread through Elizabeth's chest. Her husband's car at the scene. Why? Liberty Insurance's office was in the opposite direction. She picked up her cell phone and dialed her husband's number. No answer. She tried again. Then, a short message arrived. "Emergency. Heading to the hospital." Elizabeth took a deep breath and made a decision. Something was wrong. And she needed to find out what that something was. "Ryan, you're coming to the hospital with Mommy." "Huh? But my homework." "It's okay, I'll explain in the car." Elizabeth took her son's hand. "Someone might need our help." As they approached the intersection of Oak Street and Park Avenue, police car lights were still flashing. Officers were collecting evidence, and long skid marks remained on the ground. Elizabeth casually brought up trivial topics to keep her son's eyes away from the scene. "Hey, tell me more about that test." Entering the hospital parking lot, she spotted a familiar car, Philip's black BMW. And next to it, an unfamiliar silver minivan. For some reason, Elizabeth's heart jumped when she saw that car. Walking toward the emergency entrance, Elizabeth held her son's hand tightly. She could sense that something major had happened. But she couldn't yet imagine what it was. The sound of automatic doors opening. The smell of disinfectant. And down the hall, the sight of her husband in distress, more distraught than she had ever seen him. "He's still unconscious," echoed a doctor's voice in white coat. Elizabeth stepped forward. And then that moment arrived. As a nurse removed the patient's uniform, they discovered a distinctive heart-shaped mole on the neck. When the nurse questioned this feature, one Ryan didn't have, they checked the belongings and found the name Tommy Wilson. Contact Caroline. At that name, Elizabeth's world stopped. Caroline. The name of the sister she had cut ties with 10 years ago. And the sight of her husband slumping against the wall. All the pieces were beginning to connect in a horrifying way. The fluorescent lights of Advent Health Winter Park cast cold shadows in the hallway. Elizabeth stood there, still holding her son's hand. The name the nurse had spoken echoed in her ears like slow motion. Caroline Wilson. Her sister's name. A name she had avoided speaking for 10 years. And her husband, still leaning against the wall. All color had drained from Philip's face. "Ma'am, we've managed to reach the patient's mother," Caroline, a woman at the nurse's station, called out. "She says she'll be here in about 15 minutes. 15 minutes. In just 15 minutes, a 10-year gap would be bridged." Elizabeth looked at her son. Ryan was anxiously observing the hospital scene. "Mom, what's wrong with Dad? Is he sick?" Before she could answer, her mother-in-law Ruth rushed in. She must have been upset since that phone call. But when she saw the scene in the hallway, her expression changed. "Philip," her mother-in-law's voice carried an unprecedented sternness. "You've been..." Her husband couldn't lift his face. Seeing him like this, something inside Elizabeth began to crumble. 10 years. Estrangement from her sister. And her husband's recent behavior. The scattered pieces were coming together in a terrifying pattern. "Wait," Elizabeth suddenly raised her voice. "St. Mary's Elementary, you strongly recommended it, didn't you? Don't tell me." Philip's silence told everything. "Yes, you wanted to keep Tommy nearby." Elizabeth's voice began to shake. "That's why the high tuition didn't bother you. That's why the recent overtime, it was all lies, wasn't it?" Caroline managed to speak. "Elizabeth, Shut up." For the first time, Elizabeth's emotions exploded. 10 years ago, you abandoned our parents. And now, my family, my life. Just then, the operating room door opened. "Mom." A faint voice leaked out. Tommy had regained consciousness. Caroline rushed to her son's side. Watching her sister's back, something inside Elizabeth continued to crumble. Her sister's back. Once, it had always protected her. Now, it had become such a distant existence. "Ma'am," a nurse approached. "About the patient's heart condition." "It's the same as Ryan's, isn't it?" Elizabeth interrupted. "The doctor mentioned genetic factors." Philip raised his head. "Elizabeth, let me explain." "Explain?" Elizabeth stared at her husband. "What is there left to explain? Our children, both your children. Born with the same heart condition. In the face of this fact, any excuse." Suddenly, Ryan, who had returned from the cafeteria, called out. "Hey, that boy in the bed is wearing the same polo shirt as me." A silence fell as if time had stopped. All the adults present froze at this innocent 6-year-old's comment. Ruth placed her hand on her grandson's shoulder. "Ryan, want to get some juice with Grandma?" But Ryan was already peering into the hospital room. "Huh? He kind of looks like me." Elizabeth made a decision. With trembling hands, she took out her cell phone and dialed a number. Hello, is this Johnson Law Office? I'd like to consult about a divorce. Philip slumped against the wall. Caroline held her son in the hospital room, crying silently. And Ruth watched both her grandsons, contemplating the new shape of their family. Elizabeth, Ruth said quietly. Let's talk about what comes next, slowly. For the children's sake. Outside the window, night was falling. Different shadows began to fall in the hospital hallway. They were shadows suggesting a new family form. Tommy and Ryan. The two boys still didn't know the truth. They had met simply as friends wearing the same uniform. Their innocent encounter ironically highlighted the adults' lies and betrayals. Elizabeth slowly approached the hospital room and clearly saw her nephew's, no, Ryan's half-brother's face for the first time. Indeed, he resembled Ryan. Of course he did, the same blood flowed through their veins. Tommy, Elizabeth spoke gently. I'm your mother's sister. From now on, we're family. Her words trailed off. But in those brief words, a small hope for the future appeared. Perhaps it was the beginning of a new bond, one that transcended hatred and betrayal. Night shift nurses passed through the hallway, and the announcement for the end of visiting hours began to play. This day was coming to an end. However, this wasn't an ending, but the beginning of a new story. 6 months later, as autumn began to color the street trees of Winter Park, Elizabeth stood in her new home's kitchen, packing identical sandwiches into 2 lunch boxes. Mom, put peanut butter in mine too. Ryan's voice rang out. Me too. Tommy chimed in beside him. It was the weekend of joint custody. The 2 children had now completely bonded as brothers. Elizabeth smiled as she looked at the 2 lunch boxes. The same light blue polo shirts, the same backpacks. And 2 boys who both went for heart checkups twice a year. We don't want to be late for the First Presbyterian Church picnic, Elizabeth said, and the 2 boys rushed to get ready, competing with each other. The divorce proceeded surprisingly smoothly. Philip acknowledged all his wrongdoings and accepted almost all of Elizabeth's demands. Liberty Insurance, wanting to avoid scandal, approved Philip's transfer. He was now starting a new life in Atlanta. The relationship with Caroline was still awkward. However, for the children's sake, the sisters were gradually building dialogue. Even their past conflict over their parents' care now appeared in a different light. Caroline, Elizabeth had told her sister on the phone recently, let's have the same doctor treat our children. Comparing their symptoms might help find better treatment options. That proposal became a significant step in breaking their 10-year silence. You know, Tommy confided to Elizabeth one day in the hospital waiting room, Mom cries every night. Saying, I'm sorry. Elizabeth silently hugged the boy. That night, she called her sister for the first time in a long while. They talked about their parents. And about the meaning of each of their choices. Ruth still visited every weekend with pot roast, but now to Elizabeth's new apartment, a 10-minute walk from the house. The mother-in-law had become even more central to the family than before. Mother, Elizabeth had told Ruth recently, thank you for calling me right away when you witnessed the accident. Without that, we might never have known the truth. Ruth quietly responded, the truth always comes to light eventually. What matters is how we live afterward. At St. Mary's Elementary, Tommy and Ryan became known as the look-alike friends. Neither knew yet about their blood connection. The adults had decided to wait until they were older to tell them that story. Miss Elizabeth, the teacher, approached her during Christmas pageant preparations. "Would you mind if both your boys played angels?" At those words, Elizabeth's eyes welled up with tears. Indeed, they were like angels. A pure bond born from adults' lies and betrayals. A new traffic light had been installed at the intersection of Oak Street and Park Avenue. The traces of the accident were gone, replaced by new guideposts. Elizabeth passed through this intersection every morning on her way to work. And remembered the moment her life changed dramatically. At Sunshine Fashion, Elizabeth now spent more time in the store. "I want to build my new life with my own strength." That determination was reflected in her daily work. Caroline had moved in 3 houses down from Elizabeth. The sisters still didn't converse frequently. However, watching their children go back and forth between houses, they were gradually closing the distance between them. "Hey," Tommy said to Ryan one day, "we're like real brothers, aren't we?" Hearing those words, Elizabeth and Caroline exchanged glances. Someday, they would have to tell these children the truth. And by then, they hoped to walk together as a family bound by even stronger ties. Outside the window, the bells of First Presbyterian Church began to ring. Another new day was about to begin. Elizabeth picked up the 2 lunch boxes and called out, "Come on, let's go. Let's create our new family story."